Thank you. So welcome, as Stuart said, I think it's the second last of the series. You're lucky, it's the best one that you're going to be part of. Today, as Stuart said, it's about the intersection of innovation, transportation, and the environment. So we all know that transportation is a major contributor to the environment and our carbon footprint. A third of the increase of our carbon footprint over the last 10 to 15 years comes from our transportation, and probably all of us, or at least I did, and I felt guilty driving up the parking lot this afternoon in my car, so I parked it so that nobody could see it. But I'm the one that every morning drives from Markham to downtown, and it takes me an hour and 15 minutes, approximately, if I'm lucky, to, in the winter, 2.5 hours, and it seems to be the only way, because the train doesn't necessarily go when I need it to go. I'm from Europe, where I'm used to the train to be leaving every 15 minutes and readily available. And I've tried every other route and thought it would be quicker, but it certainly isn't. So there's clearly a problem, and I think Toronto probably is a great example where we need to be more creative and innovative. And that is really, I guess, by and large, in a simple way, the topic of today. The question that our charrette teams had to ponder over was, how can we reduce our dependency on fossil fuels by creating sustainable transportation systems? And as you heard from Stuart, we're going to hear the first team present their project. We're going to then ask all our panel members, and I'll introduce you to in a second, to just respond to it, reflect on it, and ask some questions and get some feedback after we hear all of them talk, and then you have a little break, and we do it again with the second group, and then at the end there is plenty of time for Q&A. At least that's how we designed it. Our panel today, and I'll start on this side, we have Wayne Roberts, who is with Food Policy Analyst. We have Susan Zielinski, Managing Director of SMART at the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. We have Mark, and I should have asked how to pronounce your last name. Gorgolewski. And I think I have the right to ask, because my last name is equally challenging. Professor and Program Director at Ryerson University, and David Stonehouse, General Manager of Evergreen Brickworks, where you are today. So without further ado, and not having to listen to me too much, I'd like to introduce you to the first team from Food is a Trip, the Food is a Trip charrette team, with Christopher Pandolfi and Simon Rabiniak, from the Department of Unusual Certainties. Please welcome them.
So I'm just going to bring this up. Hello, I'm Christopher Pandolfi, and that's Simon Rabinuk, and DOUC, Department of Unusual Certainties. We were the lead designers of the Food is a Trip charrette. I'll just briefly introduce ourselves. We're like a research and design practice based here in Toronto. We work on everything from information graphics to urban design. So today we're going to be talking to you about what the challenge was, which Food is not a Trip, which we immediately changed to another topic, another name. So today we're going to talk about another way to eat, or another way to look at the food system. So there was these 10 teams. I'm not sure how familiar everybody was with the process, but there was 10 teams, and we were the team that was given food plus transportation. And it was like, wow, thanks, because that's not the easiest thing to start to think about to grapple. So the original challenge for us was to think about putting a kind of a large-scale urban agricultural node, like an architectural building that would grow food and this kind of stuff in the Portlands, and then think about how to reconnect that to the area. So that was our original brief. But as we started going around, or started talking as a group, we realized one thing. One, there's tons of architects that are making these projects out there, and that could do a much better job than us. And when we actually started looking at the issues for example, 78% of the food retail market is controlled by 3 corporations, we started thinking that maybe the best way to start is not by thinking at that scale, but maybe to go a little bit bigger and challenge the actual food distribution system itself. So the charrette. So the charrette process, I can't name everybody, but wonderful group of people made up of food experts, designers, just a wide range of fields. So we basically met up, worked for 2 days on this to develop this concept, and from there we started to think about kind of how we could relate this to kind of the systems design of the food network and what was wrong with that. So just some things that we started to notice was that every year $6 billion of paid labor is sitting in gridlock. Every meal we eat requires about 20 trips. One of five trips you make is related to food. And like I said before, 78% of this market is controlled by 3 companies or corporations. And 40% of the food in the GTA goes in the garbage. So when we started looking at these kinds of things, we started thinking about how can we think about the entire system and how can the transportation options of that start to kind of create a new kind of distribution system between producers and consumers. So we had some principles that we were also working with. So we were thinking about opportunities of scale, the efficiency, quality, community engagement, and the reciprocity of the system. So as we began to think about this idea, so we started to think, how can we create this kind of system? Because there needs to be 2 kinds of components. One, there needs to be a component of connection, and then there needs to be a component of moving the food at a too high scale level. So we started to look at things like Wikipedia, creating a network that could be self-editing. So people that could join a network that could connect with farmers, distributors, people in the waste industry, and have a system that's kind of self-editing. So self-editing, excuse me. We looked at eBay with e-commerce. How do we purchase things with mobile technologies? Google to manage large-scale information systems. And the other thing that we were looking at was kind of the idea of the Internet of Things, how everything is actually like how we can radio tag things. We already have UPC coding, so we can easily track this food and move it around. So how the system can kind of work together with that if we decided to create this digital network that would connect food. But at the same time, we also wanted to look at places where people point of sale and how people are getting their food. So we looked at Swiss, for example, who have now moved towards moving their goods movement through rail as opposed to just trucks and road delivery. We looked at this idea of tiffin boxes in India, where like millions of lunches are delivered every single day to people at their work by these delivery guys. We looked at subway stores where you can virtually buy things in the subway and then get them delivered to your house. So we started to look at all the different ways people can connect with food and purchase this kind of food. That makes sense. So in the end, we took the brief and we're like, yeah, sure, we can deal with kind of like how the food system works, but we're not going to deal with it at just at the neighborhood scale. We're going to try to take it big picture. We're going to try to look at it from a different point of view, or the same point of view that those 3 companies are looking at it from. So we wanted to take it from something that looks like this, a kind of hierarchy system moving things through a very like highly sophisticated supply chain, which is very efficient and cost effective. I'm not saying that it's not, but it's maybe not the most friendly way to deliver things. To this, to some kind of system that would connect all the different frameworks or categories within the food system together through transportation and this kind of large-scale digital network with consumers, producers, and distributors, all connecting somehow via this large-scale digital infrastructure. And we call this another way to eat. So when we started to whittle down the idea, these were the main kind of things we were looking at in the food cycle. We were looking at storage, we were looking at processing, we were looking at distribution, we were looking at production, we were looking at waste, and of course we were looking at consumption. And so this is a kind of overview of how we started to break down the system. So it was looking at different types of agriculture, so things coming from the international realm, things coming from your rural realm. So what do you get from the rural? You get pork, you get beef, you get milk. From your periphery agriculture, you get things like fruits, vegetables. And from your urban, you get like herbs, sprouts, and even eggs your chicken farming. So it was kind of like looking at, where's the food actually coming from on the different scales. And then we actually started looking at nodes. So in the system, it's not like we're getting rid of nodes, but we have to rethink what these nodes could be. So again, there was, at the large scale, we would still think about terminals, something like the Ontario Food Terminal. Then at the medium scale, we started looking at things like community food centers, farmers markets, schools, churches, all these kind of things that already exist in the city that we could start turning into these kind of local food nodes, because in the end, they're generally connected with transportation. They already have communities that are associated with them. And then at the small scale, we were looking at like food boxes. Things that already exist. This is not like we were reinventing the wheel in a lot of things. We were looking at the existing functions that already exist and tried to see how we could kind of bring them together in a kind of way. And then for transportation, we looked at the same scales. International scale, cargo ships, transport truck, cargo air. Large scale, again, some ships, rail, large road vehicles. But this is where we started to play around with the idea of public transit all of a sudden. So streetcars, subways, your car, your bus, medium-sized cargo vehicles, those could all be a way to transport food around the city and around the region. And at the small scale, cycling, walking, electric cars, rollerblading, these are also things that can act as either you going to get the food or the food being delivered to you. One example that we always thought about was you could use the Bixi system, have somebody create a trailer that would just hook up to it, and all of a sudden they could become their own little food delivery business. So the idea was like thinking about how we could also open up new markets for people to, let's say, participate. So this idea was very big, so what we decided to do was, what if we brought it down to a kind of scale that we can start to understand a little bit and make the project a little bit understandable? Because right now, I imagine it's really in the air, like this digital system trying to connect people and reestablishing new forms of transportation for distribution and waste and all these kinds of things. So we wanted to look at the Ontario Greenbelt as an example of what we could do to kind of show how this could work possibly. So this is the Greenbelt. And this is we overlaid the Metrolinx 25-year transportation plan on top of it. And we started to see that in the end, there's a bunch of routes that are planned to actually make their way to the tips of the Greenbelt, if not into the Greenbelt. So why can't we start actually creating some kinds of food nodes out there that can actually connect to the farms which exist? And what farms exist? Over 200 farms exist. The small dots you see are the different farms that are, let's say, are mapped by the Greenbelt of Ontario. There could be more there, but this is the information that we were best able to collect. And the larger purple circles are the farmers markets all across Ontario, within the Greenbelt region, apologies. So we started to look at this as a way to, here's a kind of system that exists where we could start to connect not only the farmers with the existing public transit system, but also starting to see where some of these where these farmers markets nodes would exist. So we then took that into the scale, then we brought it into Toronto, and we looked at Toronto and we said, okay, let's look at Toronto's existing transportation network. So streetcars, subways, and we still kept Transit City on there because we were kind of hopeful. Then it came back and then it left again, so it's still there. Then we overlaid community gardens, churches, schools, community centers, larger community centers, on top of that, to show all the potential different nodes that could exist within the city. And then if we start to see it with the transportation route, we start to see where we can start to link GO train lines with major subway nodes and these kinds of things. So essentially what we're starting to think about is, can some of these subways, these subway stations also become food hubs, where people can go and collect the different kinds of food that they connect with the different system with through this digital infrastructure. So this is an example of transportation, for example. So one of the key things we were looking at again is transportation, but so this quick diagram here shows you a kind of like a quick example of how this could work. So it's the idea of a small truck going around, picking up different orders that people put into the system from these different farms. It then moves to the GO train station, where the GO train, separate cart. We start to think about how do we get added value from the system. Maybe there's a food cart that's attached, or a trolley that's attached to the trains that's going into the city. So from there, it ends up at a subway stop. And then from there, this is where the multiplicity comes, and this is really where we're starting to think about last mile solutions. So one idea is picking up the food, delivering it by bike. The other idea is you walking and picking it up from the subway station. And then the other idea is the bike to the person, then to the house. So it was just a kind of quick thinking about it. So looking again closer at the nodes, this is just a little bit of a zoom in. So, from the large scale, like I said, we were thinking about terminals, schools and colleges, farmers markets, religious community centers, shops and community groups, and food boxes. And then from there, what we were thinking about is the kind of activities that could occur at every single terminal. Because you can't have the whole system functioning at the same capacity all the time, right? A food box is really only for the consumer, for example. You can't expect to store things. And so this is just a quick diagram of kind of creating that little bit of a scale. And finally, this digital connection, which I imagine, it's like, what are you speaking about? So the digital connection is actually a way where through an app, through a website, where you would create a kind of digital farmer's market. But not just a farmer's market to buy food, but a market where you could also buy, where a farmer could find a distributor, where you could find someone to get rid of your food waste, where a producer can also become a consumer. If they're growing food in their backyard and don't want it, they can put it on this market and put it up for sale. So the idea is that all these different functions together would create a market that was a little bit more open, a little bit more transparent. And this would all be functioned through a large-scale digital infrastructure. And so now we're just going to show we just have a brief animation of a kind of scenario. So Simon will take that over.
Again, we just sought to close out this presentation by grounding this image of the digital network coming in contact with the mass transit network through grounding it in an example. About to show you just the context maps again. In the Greater Golden Horseshoe, we have this beautiful thing called the Greenbelt, which has fertile soil. There are many farms that are reasonably close to our expanding mass transit system. We identified Nukura Farms. It's just outside of St. Catharines. It's reasonably small. It grows a variety of things, but has quite a few peaches. It's a point of sale farm, so people actually travel there to purchase farms. It also sells at the farmers markets around it, but actually it produces more than, it has more that it can sell. Through this, we've shown just some quick connections. Nukura is only 7 kilometers away from the St. Catharines GO train station. On the GO train, it's about a 120-kilometer ride to Toronto into Union Station, the heart. From Union Station to Broadview, it's another 7. And then carbon-free last mile, a bike courier brings a shipment of their peaches to the Brickworks Farmers Market, where all of us can purchase them on Saturday. With this example, piggybacking on mass transit reduces the number of trucks on the road, so there's also the opportunity for the carbon-free last mile. And then this smaller scale producer can also enter into a larger market, potentially growing, having an opportunity to connect with consumers through that.
So in conclusion, some key points for this idea for us are the idea of reducing trips. And when we say reducing trips, we don't necessarily mean reducing trips with how the food moves, but reducing trips through carbon emission trips. Trying to create equality and competition, trying to open up new markets to different types of food growers that aren't, let's say, mega farms or mega agriculture. Creating a transparent market creates more choice for the consumer. It creates new opportunities for business, like the idea that this system could be opened up allows new people to create new ideas to how to make the system better. Thinking about transportation from not only people moving, but goods moving. And that's also kind of the point we wanted to get across. It's not just about moving people in the GGH, but it's also about moving our goods, because it's trucks that are helping to clog up our roads, not just people in cars. Strengthening existing transportation systems by giving them added value. This is if this were to exist, the possibility that using, it's not like it's free. It's not like you could just put the farmer or these people could use the public transit for free. They would pay. They would pay to ship their goods using the system. And that's a kind of another way of possible funding source that we can get for public transit. Creating a space for the consumer to become a producer and vice versa. The idea now of just you being something and you being something else is not the new normal in this day and age. We said piggybacking off existing systems and more attractive. It's like, in this case, we're not really pushing it, but it's like the more attractive to eat local when the system works better and brings the cost down. So thank you very much, and that's another way to eat. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes. Thank you very much, guys. I'm just thinking, what are you doing with my mega grocery store in this beautiful asphalted parking lot where I can park my SUV, but we'll worry about that later. So I thought it was great and very interesting. Again, and I've been now to a few of these these sessions. The ideas you see, it's not something at least I think of on an everyday basis. So it's kind of it's inspiring to think outside of the box. We're going to let our panel respond to this. And actually, this is one of your mics. We'll just go down this way for the first part. And then after the break, the second one will go that way. If you just a couple of minutes, give some thoughts. And if you guys remember what they say, and then you can have some time to respond to it.
Yeah, please. Well, thank you very much for that. I think it's a really exciting conversation. I actually spent a weekend with a group of designers who were sponsored by both Evergreen and the Institute Without Borders at George Brown College. I found it one of the more exciting things I was involved in when I used to work for the city. And that'll show you something about my technical knowledge. But first of all, I would contrast what they've just done with a couple of reports around pedestrianization that have come out. The Board of Health did a report on it about almost a year ago. The Ontario Coroner just did a report, and the City of Chicago just tabled a report. And what was interesting to me about all of them is that the only thing they looked at was pedestrian safety and cars, which might hit pedestrians. And what makes this unique is that they're trying to throw in a whole bunch of other things, like pedestrian safety. In my mind, the solution to pedestrian safety is going to be good for main streets, it's going to be good for exercise and heart disease, it's going to be good for pollution reduction, it's going to be good for a whole series of things. We don't want to just have that tunnel vision on one thing. And I think what they bring to it is, let's look at it, not just to solve one problem, but to solve multiple problems. So I want to thank them for that. I think the other thing is I think that they bring to it is this concept of piggybacking. And I know George Hazel, who Sue may be able to tell us about a bit more, thought we have to start thinking about the transit system as really an excuse for a retailer. That really, how many places have you got millions of people going through it every day? And let's pile on some other functions and not make it pay for itself just by carrying people from one place to another. And so if you get out at Main and Danforth and you just have to go up the stairs, what is now just a one-story building, which is a shameful waste of space, and I just go upstairs and pick my food up that somebody has dropped off, I've got another function for this place. And so I think that's another, it's another way, not only another way to eat, but another way to think about city infrastructure. And that's what I'd like to thank them for.
Do you have a question for them as well, or do you want to come back to that?
Maybe I'll come back after. Thanks.
I have 4 questions for them, so maybe. I had a problem with this because I I went through, I looked at it on the web beforehand, and then I went through the exhibit, and I so loved it, and I thought, I've got to be on a panel. What am I going to say? This is just so great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to list the things I love about it and why, and then I'm going to ask you the 4 questions that came to my mind. Is that all right with you? Yeah. Okay, so why I loved it was because of the systems approach, as Wayne said. And I love the case studies you found. They were so diverse, and that really kind of put the it didn't put concrete on it, it made it real. And I love the idea of the ephemeral use of the churches and the transit centers, just as you're saying. And it reminded me of Jamie Lerner, who invented the bus rapid transit in Curitiba, Brazil in the 70s. And he has all these great concepts like urban acupuncture and ephemeral use of space. And it's sort of similar to what Robin Chase, who invented Zipcar, would call collaborative consumption. And this whole way of combining uses and fractional use and having the best use of something over time. So with the car, you can have car share, and it's just like hotel nights. And this actually then brings in more to the whole transportation sharing component. So I really loved it. And the idea of urban acupuncture, where there are points in a city that are really exciting and beautiful and bring many things together in unexpected ways. What's the name of your?
Unusual search.
Unusual, yes. I love the new markets that you were talking about. We have a prize in transportation for sustainable transportation enterprises. So people who have thought up either iPhone apps or really cool services like food delivery. And one of the finalists was called Golden Pheasant in Detroit, and they combined urban farming with bicycling and a whole range of things. And I'm hoping that some of the people that you're connecting with will apply for the prize next year. And I loved, of course, the use of the internet for moving less, because one of the things when we're thinking about transportation, we often think only of moving people, and we don't think about moving less by either better land use and urban design and community design, or by tele-everything, like telecommute, teleshop, and I loved your expansion of that. So here are the 4 questions. Are you ready? The first thing is the food, the transit part of the food, that's actually just in the transit stations, right? It's not on the buses, or is it actually on the buses as well?
So, I mean, you can hear me, right, if I talk like this?
But before we go into too much and then not have time,
Okay.
if you wouldn't mind mentioning the questions,
Can I write them down?
you can write them.
Okay, so that was one thing. And then my another question was, who runs the system? At first, I thought it was sort of distributed, sort of like Wall Street. There's no leader. And I wondered if nobody runs it. I love that idea, but if nobody runs it, then how do they get the information? Maybe that's through IT. That's a whole bunch of questions all in one. And then I thought of a new market for food carrying that would be all kind of, freezer bag kind of things, and I wondered if people have dealt with that kind of stuff. How do they move it around if it's not in a bike trailer? How do they keep it cold? Deal with public health concerns and all those. And then the last thing was, does this make it possible for people to actually work on the farms that are peri-urban or even rural if the transit is a better connection to those places? So that way they could go work on the farm and then bring some food home.
Okay. First of all, I'd just like to apologize. My voice is going, so I'm going to try as best I can. I think that what I found really interesting, and I think your project raised many questions and many interesting points, and I think that's the purpose of this whole exercise. So I think it was very successful from that point of view. What I particularly wanted to focus on is, first of all, the fact that you address things at different scales, which I think is a key issue in anything of this kind. Thinking at the bigger scale down to the smaller scale, and what works at the bigger scale, and what solutions are appropriate at the big scale, and what solutions are appropriate at the smaller scale. And I think you addressed the scale and you looked at different approaches at different scales, and I think that's very important to find what works in each context. And the other aspect is exploring existing potentials in the city and in the system, and how do we use the existing potentials that are not being fulfilled, whether it's space, whether it's the nodes of interaction like the subway stations that you've identified, whether it's the school lands. I think it's that there's lots of existing potential, both within the city, within the peri-urban environment. I think we should also distinguish between different parts of the city, because the downtown or the midtown is different from the suburbs and has different strengths, different weaknesses, different issues. And I think looking at those is very important. But identifying potentials that are there in the city that can be exploited through a system of this kind, because that's how things are going to start to happen. If you try and impose something which isn't really based on existing potential, it's going to be much more difficult to make it happen. So I think that was an important aspect of this. So I think I'll just finish with a couple of questions for you as well. One is this a question of different characteristics in different areas? I mean, you showed an example from St. Catherine's down to Brickworks. Do you think that the infrastructure is there or is readily achievable within different parts of the city? So for instance, in the suburbs, could you actually implement these ideas within the suburban context? Because many of us, probably most of us, well, I don't know about here, but many Torontonians and many urban dwellers live in the suburbs. And so we need to address the characteristics of the suburbs and how these sorts of systems will work in the suburbs. And the other question I had was regarding the infrastructure in the rural and the peri-urban areas, because the links, it seemed to me, the way I understood it, rely on a significant existing transport infrastructure within those areas, which the food could then, the produce could then be, or would use to bring it into the city. And you identified the rail network from St. Catherine's, but what proportion of the food shed, if you want to use that word, or the area that we're looking at, actually has the sorts of networks beyond the road networks, should we say, or are we really back to relying on the road networks to make this happen?
Yeah, I think my main question, similar to that of others, is around who organizes the deliveries. I can imagine going online and ordering a basket of peaches, Ontario peaches, which I love. I can imagine how that transaction works. I can't imagine how the peaches arrive on my doorstep. I think that's the hard part of this. I can imagine a whole new industry. I can imagine a company like UPS getting very involved in this kind of thing, but also small-scale businesses, and I can imagine that this would be very labor-intensive as well. So again, how does the delivery part of this work? I think that's the head herder in this one.
I'll start with Sue, correct? Yes. So the first question was about the food being just in the major transit stops. Is that correct? That's not necessarily the case. But the point is thinking about them as major hubs for when you're looking at the larger scales out, bringing like a lot of food into the city, for example. But if you're working at a scale of, let's say, at the city level, where you don't need to get that much, and let's say there's an urban farmer or community gardens where you can get that from, then you have multiple destinations, like the community center, for example, could be the node for that point. I think it's about where you track or trace the amount and the quantity of what you need and where that can come from at the greatest pace or something. So that's that one. Who runs the system? Sorry. Yes.
It was more, when I first read about it, I thought that it was actually people taking food on the transit.
Oh, I mean, that's possible. but for us, we also want to look at the transit system as, I mean, trains move goods. Why can't the GO train move goods on off hours, right? There's these other things that can possibly exist. The infrastructure's there, the train exists. If the economy becomes possible, you can do it, right? So there's these things like the subway, they clean the subway at night. The trains run and they do this kind of work at night. So why can't we also be running food to these storage areas at the same time? So we were thinking about also not just using the system for light sources, light uses, but also how could it be up to more, I don't want to say industrial scale, but to a larger scale. Who runs the system? This is a very great question. So how am I going to answer this? Very easily. So we invest money as a society in roads and in physical infrastructures all the time. Why won't we invest money in digital infrastructures? Why can't the government be the one that, someone's going to say, yeah, but the government's austerity and they're cutting back. But the point is that we still fix the roads, we still build new roads, we still build new physical types of infrastructure. Why not start to get into digital infrastructure? What's good about building digital infrastructure? If this is a system which is run by a public entity, for example, all of a sudden there's all that data that we can start collecting. The system is also collecting data. It's not just connecting people, but it's also collecting data. It's collecting what people want, what they need, who's lacking what. Like, you can collect all these different forms of data, which we're starting to see in this day and age. Information is money, and it's also kind of power. So it would be great to know that this kind of information could be collected and used by the people, for the people. But as the system starts to progress, it can then be starting to take over by the individuals. The idea is that the system itself, once it starts running, is running on a flux. So it's like, I know how to use the system, it starts to work by itself. But you need the push, and of course, for us, the push comes from the public. So that's a kind of position. Food melting from the freezer, or these kinds of things. This is a very good question, because the reality is that we're not into that detail yet, thinking about this. So I can't give you an honest answer. I could say, yeah, that bike's got a freezer on it, but it's like, that's not a fair response. So in terms of the detail that we're thinking, we're not at that scale yet. We're thinking about the small scale, but we're not thinking about the actual technical requirements for what that exists at. And does it make it possible for people to go to the farm? I mean, would you like to go to the farm? Is it a possible, like, if this is a very good idea, for example, that could be added into the system. And so it's not just, it has to move like this. The idea is that it should run the way ever you want it to run. So, next, there was another question. Do you think the suburban context? This is also a very good question. Why? Because we know that you're completely correct. We cannot run this the same way that we could run it into the city, for example, because the infrastructure is not there. But like all systems, this is not a one carpet bomb solution. You can't just go tomorrow and say, there it is, it's done. It's a slow process. And so the same way that we're thinking about scales from the top coming down, because that's always an easy way to think about it from the international down to the local, the reality is that the system would actually get fueled on the local. That actually it would build its way up to the point where where the support network would come where it's strongest at the thing and then spread back out almost the other direction, which is slightly problematic, but you could do it in a less kind of way. So you still have GO train stations which are existing in the periphery or the suburbs or cities like Mississauga, which is Canada's 4th densest city now and maybe is not a suburb anymore. We need to start reconsidering what we call suburbs in the GGH, because I don't consider Mississauga a suburb anymore. And that city there is, if you look at their plans, they're growing transit, the Huron-Ontario line, they got a major light rail thing that's coming up. So there are these links that are happening where the system could be slowly implemented, but of course never to the velocity that it could be into the city. I hope that does a thing. The infrastructure links in the system of the rural, again, this would still be dependent at this point, still on smaller delivery trucks going around and picking things up. But however, if you had one truck collecting multiple deliveries from a place, like zoning it off, it could then reduce the number. Instead of each farmer having their own delivery service to a kind of collective one, it would then reduce the number of trips. So yes, this is still a problem, and some infrastructure would need to be built for this to happen. However, again, as the system started, you would use what you had to get it going. You wouldn't build first. You would see what you had to see if it could grow. organizing the delivery. This is, again, a good question, but this is a speculative question, speculative answer that I can give. In the end, we know that we have multiple systems that are running now on the internet where we buy goods and services, and somehow that these systems they've been figured out. From the small scale, you go to Craigslist, you buy something from Craigslist, you purchase it, you meet the person there, you pick it up. If it doesn't work out, you get a bad review written about you. On eBay, it's the same thing. If the system deliveries are failing with the producers at first, then all of a sudden the system will start to say, this person is not reliable delivering their goods. So what does that do? That means maybe people don't start ordering from them. So the system will start to think, how do I reshape my business? Or how do I reshape that network? The other idea is the hope that you mentioned things like UPS, but that would come on board. The other mention is that people would see this as an opportunity and try to fill those gaps which existed. So for example, if the system started working and people started to adopt it, and there was the potential to make money, I for sure would know, I could almost get, especially in this market where it's all about starting new and innovative ideas because we don't really have a lot of jobs left right now, is that you could see people starting to try to figure out how they could be part of that and, oh, I have a truck. Great, I can become part of the system. So it's relying on also things like this, not just thinking about the mass, that's kind of what we were trying to move, but also how can somebody with 2 trucks become a delivery service? So things like this. Or how can somebody with a bike? Or I bought 3 bikes and I hired 3 people and now we're not mail couriers anymore, we're food couriers. So it's a very difficult question to, I don't know, I think it could work in this way, but in the end, I don't. Labor intensive, yes, good. I'm glad it's labor intensive because that means a lot of people working. It means that we could find new markets, open up new things, and I'm hoping that the labor intensive comes from the actual delivery of things and the actual movement in that realm, where the digital network would begin to take care of the other kinds of labor of moving the system around, which that can help that part out and make that less labor intensive and get more people spinning out new ideas for the system. I hope I did a bit of a job answering those questions. I think that was all of them. Yes? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.